Well, good evening. It's good to see everybody. We're glad that you're back out tonight, and wanted to let you know how much I've enjoyed the weekend. Weekend meetings always just seem to fly by, and you start them and they're over. But if you're a preacher and you're away from your family and away from your home, you always kind of enjoy weekend meetings. You still get to preach and be with people and get to know them, but you also get to be back home. I'm going to have to be in the area for a few days. Our house had not sold yet in College Station, and so we're in the process of closing on that, and we have renters that have to be out at the end of this month, so I told the elders I just need to hang here until I can see the condition of the house and make sure everything's going well. So please pray for that and keep that in your prayers this week, that everything will go well and we can move on with our life. It always seems like you're still back wherever you were when your house hasn't sold. Thank you to the elders. I appreciate you all men that I have known now for a few years. Obviously Don, since he was slightly out of kindergarten and maybe a little bit beyond, but we have been fast friends for a long time, and out of that have grown friendship with the Arents and with Brother Ray and with her, Tracy's mom and dad. I think, her brother. Just think about people that I wouldn't have known otherwise, and my life has been enriched for that. And I think a lot of Don and his work, and I know that you do too. And so thank you for valuing him and Tracy, and for the good work that they do. Thank you to everyone who I've eaten with this week. I appreciate you. The Betancourts, I really am glad that we've got to know each other every meal. They just ended up being invited by everybody. They invited me one night, and then they've been on the list almost with every one of them. But I've enjoyed getting to know them, enjoyed getting to know their girls, and ribbing them a little bit. So thank you. If you're ever up in our part of the world, come by and see us. We're by the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. Springdale's just right next to Fayetteville, so it's a beautiful part of the world. We'd love to have you drop by. Tonight I want us to talk about a lesson that I call Raise Them Right. Proverbs 22:16 that we have looked at, Proverbs 22:6 that we have looked at before and talked about. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Is a maxim that is not absolute, but yet there is a strength to that. There is an understanding that most of the time this is how it works. If we train them up the way they should go, then they'll continue in that. I read a book a few years ago entitled The Naked Truth. It was written by a lady named Lakita Garth. I'm going to tell you that book is a very thin book. It is chock full of good advice from a mother who reared 5 young people in the ghetto. And her advice is good because it mirrors the Bible. Her dad died of cancer when she was 11 years old. She has 4 older brothers. He had been in the Air Force for 27 years. He had fought in World War II, in Korea, and in Vietnam. The doctors believe his cancer came from Agent Orange. But she reared them as a single mother who never remarried. And the stories that Lakita tells in that book are really, I think, important. When you think about some of the statements that I came across in that book, impressionable minds live up to the expectations placed upon them. If we set the bar high, in other words, that expect that our children reach that bar, then we have a good expectation to believe that if we're helping them, encouraging them, even pushing them at a time, correcting them when they need it, that they're going to get there. I mean, a home that doesn't demand good grades, if a home doesn't demand respect for a teacher, that says if you agree to do something, you follow through with it. All of these are things that are what? Going to be important to the person you hire at your workplace, right? You're going to want somebody like that. You're going to want somebody who has that kind of discipline. And so as our brother prayed a minute ago, this world is a messed up place. And I bet every day at work you see it. I know teachers do. If you're a public teacher, you're on the front lines of seeing what is happening in our world. And every day you witness the kind of mess that's going on with people that are divorced and the effect it has on their children, and people that don't know what gender they are, and all of the things that we're watching in our world. It's no wonder that we have the problems that we do. But if you set that bar high, as Ms. Garth says in her book. In fact, the Bible talks about that, doesn't it? In Proverbs 23, verse 22, it says, "Listen to your father who begot you, and do not despise your mother when she is old. Buy the truth and do not sell it, also wisdom and instruction and understanding." I bet you know verse 23. You've heard that, right? But you pluck it like I do out of context. Now, it's a verse that can be taken out of context, lifted out of context. It still means that. Buy the truth and do not sell it. But I want you to see the context it's in. It's in the context of family. It's spoken in the context of listening to your father and listening to your mother and knowing that the truth they tell you is vital. Go on with it at verse 24. "The father of the righteous will greatly rejoice, and he who begets a wise child will delight in him. Let your father and your mother be glad. Let her who bore you rejoice. My son, give me your heart and let your eyes observe my ways. Buy the truth and sell it not." Now, we've heard that many, many times, but it's spoken in the context of a family. It's spoken in the context of what we teach them, what we want to bring to them. So when Miss Garth talks about that, she says, it was important to Mama that we followed the rules. Be in the house, she said, before the street lights come on. To this day, Miss Garth says that when she sees a neighborhood without street lights, she wonders how the kids know when to come home. Because in her neighborhood, when it got dark, bullets and drug dealers and other bad things happened after dark. And Mama loved her kids, and that rule was enforced. In fact, she says in that book, this statement, if we don't raise our children right the first time, we'll end up raising them the rest of their lives. That's a statement that where I've preached this lesson before just sort of resonates with people. They go away. I've seen them put it on Facebook after I've left. I didn't think about that when I first preached it, but when I think about that statement, how many people have you seen have to continue raising their kids in adulthood? I've seen it too many times. I've seen people that have had to pay the price because they didn't do it right the first time. Folks, here's the reality. We have one shot at this. You get one shot at it. You're young, you don't know everything, and sometimes that seems to be a burden in itself. We're called on to rear our children at a time when we're still young and that we don't know everything, but the reality is exactly that. We get one shot at it. And if we don't rear them right the first time, we will rear them the rest of our lives. They will always be in and out of our house messes that have to be dealt with. She demanded good grades and got them because she expected that bar to be held high. When she went to a teacher's meeting, Ms. Garth said she asked their teachers to assign them extra homework. As teens, they thought their mama was old-fashioned, out of touch, clueless, but it was amazing to see the transformation in just a few years with wisdom. She was a strict disciplinarian. If they weren't in when the street lights went off, she'd drive the neighborhoods looking for them. Mrs. Garth's friends called her the warden. One Thanksgiving after the four brothers and Lakita were grown, they started reminiscing about the kids that had grown up in their neighborhood. Mookie and Tyrone were high school All-Americans, a wrestler and baseball player. Today they're both crackheads. Their brains were fried. Next door to Mookie and Tyrone was an amazing baseball player named Shaquille. Instead of making the big time, today he's a drug lord. One of his employees shot a guy who lived behind Lakita's house, Kenny, execution style, because he wasn't paying his drug bill. Kenny's brother Boyd was on parole for running a prostitution ring. Gail, one of Boyd's girls, lived across the street from Lakita. She died of AIDS. Sherry lived next door to Gail, and in her 8th month of pregnancy, she OD'd, killing herself and her baby. And then she says these words. On that Thanksgiving afternoon, we went down the street in our conversation. We went through name after name, face after face, house after house, and most of the kids we grew up with are either disappeared, been incarcerated, or were living on government assistance or had been found dead. We replayed everyone's life. That's when we realized that we were the only complete family to make it out of that neighborhood intact. There were other people who made it out, but there wasn't one other single household that didn't have at least one sad story like the ones I just told. Lakita's brothers, Kevin is an anesthesiologist, Leon is a lawyer in Southern California, Mark is an engineer, David's retired military, and Lakita is president and CEO of her company. Why did they make it out? She asked those questions. Were we smarter than anyone else? Did we have more money than everyone else? Government programs? None of those things. Sitting at that table that Thanksgiving Day, she says they all realized that they had these things in common. The first is they had a mama who was God-fearing. Every child needs a God-fearing parent or parents, a visible parent instilling fear in an invisible God. She said to them numerous times, she mentions it in the book, I may not be able to see everything you do or hear everything you say, but God's watching, and everything you do, God is writing in a book. Now, where did she get that? The Bible tells us, doesn't it, in Philippians, the 4th chapter, that He's writing our names in a book. There are other passages in the Bible that speak of this book. I urge you also, true companion, help these women who labored with me in the gospel, with Clement also, and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. Revelation talks about it in chapter 20, verses 12 through 15. I mean, people can make fun of that, they can belittle it, they can ignore it to their peril, but Lakita's mama was right. There is a book that God is keeping the names of all people. I may not be there to hear you, she told them. I may not be there to see it, but God is watching. And that's the thing we need to impart to our kids, that God is going to judge them, that God is going to bring them an account for everything that they do. They're going to bring me into account for everything that I do. When I watched Dee's funeral, I wasn't able to attend it, Dee Bowman. But I watched it online, and at one point this statement was made in that funeral. Life is short, Dee said. Death is certain. Judgment is inevitable. If we would just keep those basic things before us, what a difference it would make in all of our lives if I woke up saying that every day. My life is short. Death is certain. Judgment is inevitable. We have had young people that we would not thought would have left this world. John Banks, who would have thought such a shining light, such a great strength to so many, would have his life snuffed out by 30. None of us have the promise of tomorrow. And whatever time we have on this earth, we need to burn brightly. We need to burn for the Lord. We need to know that judgment is certain. In Hebrews 4, verse 12 and 13, for the word of the Lord, or God, is living and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of soul and spirit and of joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. Then listen to him. There is no creature hidden from His sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of Him to whom we must give account. I wondered about the title of her book, Naked Truth. The fact that nothing we do is not seen by God. We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive the things done in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. We need to listen to what Mama Garth was saying, right? We need to understand that when parents are around, God will take over. She tells a story that at a drugstore with their neighborhood buddies, they had measly change that they found between the cushions on the couch. We didn't have an allowance. She said one time when her dad was still alive, her brother had been brave enough to ask their dad, why don't we get an allowance like other kids? He said, you already have an allowance. Dad allows you to eat his food, watch his TV, and live in his house. Friends urged them at the drugstore, because they didn't have enough money, to steal some candy that nobody would know. But they just stood there, looked at them, and shook their head and said, we knew God was watching, and He'd tell Mama. We ought to have that kind of understanding and attitude. Turn back with me, if you would, to Proverbs, the 1st chapter. I remember one time I was heading to school with Jonathan, my son, when he was little, and he started telling me about some kids that wanted him to do something that was wrong. And so I thought to myself, where else to go but Proverbs 1? And so I started quoting him the part of this passage that I could remember. Hear, my son, your father's instruction. Forsake not your mother's teaching. Then he said, my son, at verse 10, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without reason. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive, whole like those who go down to the pit. We shall find all precious goods, and we shall fill our houses with plunder. Throw in your lot among us, and we'll all have one purse. My son, do not walk in the way with them. Hold back your foot from their paths. For their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood. For in vain is a net spread in the sight of any bird. But these men lie in wait for their own blood. They set an ambush for their own lives. Such are the ways of everyone who's greedy for unjust gain. It takes away the life of possessors. I started preaching to Jonathan saying, don't you follow what they said. You do what is right no matter what. And Jonathan got all into it, and he would get real excited sometimes. He said, yeah, Dad, and we ought to punch their lights out. And I said, well, no, there's passages about that too. But get the principle. He knew it was wrong, and he was hearing, and you're imparting, and you remind them again and again. We need mamas, we need daddies that follow God and instill fear in the invisible God in their kids. Secondly, she said in the book, we need parents who are not afraid to parent. The disastrous tale of young people that grow up in disrespect and disobedience. I can remember a congregation that I preached at many years ago had an only child of a couple, and he was constantly in trouble. He had wrapped his car one time around a tree, and it's a wonder he didn't kill himself. Thank goodness he had no one else with him and didn't hit somebody else. But it was because he was drunk. And again and again and again, those kind of stories could be told about him. And one day, somebody told me about the time that when he was a little kid, that he came up to the bench where his father was sitting, and he looked at his dad and said, "Move over, stupid." And as the brother told me, he said, "Stupid moved over." I guarantee you, folks, if I'd have said that to my dad, you would have asked somebody else for a gospel meeting. Because you would have never heard from me. You would have heard from a different person. Because that ought not to be permitted. And yet sometimes we tolerate, we want them to be our friends. They're not going to be our friends until they grow up and they're older and they lean on us for advice. I'm not your friend. I'm your dad. I'm your parent. And I'm called on to make some hard decisions at times. What did David not do with Adonijah? He did not rebuke him, the Bible says, at any time for what Adonijah had done. In 1 Samuel 29, what did we read about Eli? You honor your sons more than me. One of our sweet girls at Lacey Starling, when she was at Bryan College Station, graduated and started teaching school at Bryan, which was a rougher type of neighborhood. And she was a high school math teacher. She told me the shocking story that their class was talking, and she asked them to be quiet and quit talking, and they started barking at her like dogs. I want to tell you, folks, that's the kind of thing teachers see constantly. It's the kind of thing that tells you a barometer of what kind of mamas they have and what kind of daddies they have. I would have never dreamed of doing that. I may have done some things that are wrong, but that's one line I understood. I understood if I did that, you'd have somebody else for the gospel meeting. That would not be tolerated in the home that I grew up in. And Lakita said her mom would not either tolerate those kinds of disrespect. She tells some of the stories. I want you to remember a passage in the Old Testament. This is a strange passage, but when you look at it, it's telling us exactly what we're talking about tonight. Do you remember it was the story of Elijah going by a village, and he's on his way. And I want you to understand what village it was, Bethel. Now you've got to get that in your mind. What was at Bethel? Do you remember that's where Jeroboam set up one of the golden calves? When he started seeing the fact that all of his people, when the kingdom's divided in two, would always go back annually to the feasts that were in Jerusalem, he said, I'm going to lose my people if they go back to Rehoboam. So I'll make them gods and say, these are the gods that brought you out of the land of Egypt. You don't need to go up anymore. And he made feast days and made priests from every tribe, not from the tribe of Levi. And he set up a god at Bethel and at Dan. Dan at the far north of his kingdom, and Bethel right at the southern border that led to Jerusalem, just a few miles. Now you've got to get that in your mind that these people now have for several decades followed this false teaching. What kind of kids grew up in that place? Here's a clue to it. Then he went up from there to Bethel, and as he was going, the prophet of God, as he was going up the road, some youths came from the city and mocked him and said to him, Go up, you bald head, go up, you bald head. So he turned around and looked at them and pronounced a curse on them in the name of the Lord, the name of Jehovah, of Yahweh. And 2 female bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the youths. That's one of those strange stories you read in the Bible and you wonder, what do I do with that? Well, you do with it what we need tonight in this lesson. First of all, Bethel was a place of terrible ungodliness. Nobody's following God. Nobody cares about God. It's the place where one of the golden calves is set up. Those youths weren't people that didn't understand right from wrong. The youth, when you look at the word in Hebrew, probably means a boy that's 10 to 12 years of age. I don't know. I think this row with the guys that have the kind of black and white shirts, would y'all be 10 to 12? Is that where you are? Yeah. All right. Do you know better than that? Would you yell to Brother, we'll just put Brother Don up as our example. Would you yell to Brother Don when he's going by, come here, bald, or go up, bald head, go up, bald head? I have a feeling your dad would have something to say. You'd know better than that, wouldn't you? And we're not dealing with little kids that don't know the difference, who say something funny and we know it's out of line because it's not the right thing, but because of their age, we don't punish them. These are youths old enough to know who this prophet of God is. They know who he is. And they mock him as the prophet of God as he's going up that way. And I want you to understand, when the bears come out, they mauled 42 of them. Do you know what that tells me? There were more than 42 of them. Now, if you were all of a sudden accosted on a road as you're passing a city by, let's just double that number, maybe 80 boys come running out, you're not going to be able to fend off 80 boys if they attack you. You're going to be at their mercy to whatever they do to you. And then when he turns around and curses them in the name of the Lord, you need to understand that he understood what was going on. Boys that should have known better, boys that should have been reared better, boys that should have respected him because he's the mouthpiece of God. They're not respecting God. And when he curses them in the name of the Lord, don't miss this. God answered. It's God that sent those 2 female bears. It's God that sent those 2 female bears to maul boys that are 10 to 12 years old because they don't show any respect for their elders. They didn't show any respect for a prophet of God, ultimately not showing respect to God himself. As strange as that story may be, we need to see it for what it is. God hates that kind of thing. And he shows it in a graphic way in this story. Too many times we face people in our society who are people disrespectful of God and of elderly folks and others. Lakita tells the story of coming out of one of her presentations on abstinence at a Kentucky school, and she saw a girl cussing out her mother. Lakita walked up to them and said to the girl, "Do you eat out of that same dirty mouth that you just spoke those words to your mother?" The mother looked at her sadly and said, "She talks to me like this all the time." Lakita said, "I wanted to backhand the mother, not the teenage girl." The girl put her hands on her hips, cocked her head to the side and said to Lakita, "You ain't my mama." Lakita said, "I ain't your dentist either, but you speak like that to me, I'll snatch every tooth out of your mouth." Now, I'm not here to say that what she said to them was the right thing, but I'm here to say it's like that. The disrespect for those that are older, the disrespect for those that ought to be shown respect, especially talking to her mother like that. I watched on TV, you may have too, back in October of 2019, September, Antifa harassing an elderly lady that was crossing a crosswalk in Canada. Maybe some of you remember that. What happens to a society when it leaves God, when it has no discipline, when there's no one saying you should respect God and you should respect His law and you should respect those who are your elderly? That kind of junk happens and it spreads. Parents who aren't afraid to spank their children. I know we live in a time that it can be dangerous. Met a man a minute ago that was telling me about knowing Jay Brown. Dale Brown was one of our deacons. He passed away, as many of you know. I was at his funeral, and our brother was there too. But I don't know if you knew that we had a paddle in the back that was called Dale's paddle. Dale's paddle. When I first got there, he had his 3 boys, and they were, I think the oldest Zach was 8, all the way down to the youngest one was just a little bitty guy. He was about 2 or 3 when I moved there. I can still see in my mind's eye when Dale had reached his limit. He just got up and got the youngest by the hand. He's like a mess crying. And here they go out the back, and I knew they were heading for Dale's paddle because it was a paint stirrer. That was, if it's still laying there, I told people not to mess with it after he passed. It was laying in the coat rack. Everybody understood that Dale was following what God said. I fear that present-day young families who are Christians are not following what God says. I realize there are other ways to discipline your children and use those, but also listen to God. I'm not saying to you to be foolish. We live in a time that it wasn't that way when I grew up. Not only could my mom and dad spank me in public and nobody's going to do anything about it, they're going to turn me into Child Protective Services. But my mom and dad gave permission to aunts and uncles and teachers and everybody else. If you disrespected another person who had good common sense and was an older person than you, that they had the right to spank me. Our rule at home was if you get spanked at school, you're going to get 2 at home. Because they are the authority. They are the ones that are trying to teach you what to do and right. But we don't live in that world anymore. And I realize if you were to spank your kids out at McDonald's or somewhere, somebody might make great trouble for you. So I say to you, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, but listen to God. And what does God say in the book of Proverbs? He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. Or you read Proverbs 22:15, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of correction will drive it far from him. Somebody says, well, the rod could be, it's just using it metaphorically. It just means that you're using discipline. Well, what about this one? Proverbs 23:13-14, same rod throughout the book of Proverbs. Do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, does that sound metaphorical or literal? He will not die. You shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from hell. Folks, he's not talking about, if you think the word beat means that you're leaving bruises and cutting flesh and doing all that, as one guy said, God has given extra padding in the place that matters, where you might have to administer that rod. Final passage, Proverbs 29:15, the rod and rebuke, there are your 2. There's that other form of discipline. But there has to be, as James Dobson used to say in his book, pain is a marvelous purifier. That people come to, as little people, to understand that there's consequences. If we misbehave, there's consequences. Later they transfer that to what you and I understand in principles of Scripture and other places of not doing things that are wrong. We get one shot, folks, at raising our family. Do you know more than the generations that have come before you? In your 20s and 30s, have you become all wise and in need of no counsel from older and wiser people who have reared their children to adulthood? Lakita's mother, when she would have to administer that discipline, spank her kids, she would take them up in her arms and hold them in the rocking chair and rock them, and she would say to them, I'm your mother, and I love you no matter what you think right now. But I'm not trying to win a popularity contest. My job is to be your mother. One of her brothers made the mistake and asked their mama, how come we can't call you by your first name like we do our friends? She said, looked at him, and he knew he had asked the wrong thing. Boy, there are 6 billion people on this planet, and any one of them can be your friend, but you only have one mama. She grabbed the big phone book, dropped it on the floor with a thud and said, if you don't like the way I run this house, then go look up another family and move in with them. When you grow up and are older, your parents will become your friends. They will be your counselors. And that's what you're aiming for in the life of your children. Parents who train their children and don't just raise them. My dad used to say, I know a lot of people that can hatch them. Precious few that know how to rear them. A lot of people do no more than their children than give them the latest designer clothes and iPods and unrestricted access to the internet and TV and cell phones and all of the things that are part of our culture. And they don't discipline their kids. You can always spot a young person who has been raised versus a young person who has been trained, who has been demanded to follow the things that God has said, or at least good principles in life. Training requires self-sacrifice, service, affection, discipline, in short, agape love, doing what is in the highest best interest of the one that you love. In turn, young people respect themselves and respect their parents and respect other adults. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. We will never, as parents, regret all the hard stuff we had to do to shape our young people and mold them into the right kind of adults, the adults that are disciples of God, no matter how hard that stuff is to do at the time. But we will live to regret forever children that we have to keep on rearing when they reach adulthood because we didn't do what we ought to do when it mattered. Be biblical parents. Learn from the mistakes of the Bible that we talked about the other night, and others that we may have mentioned. And learn the positive, uplifting examples, not only of those that you can look around and see. When you look at the elders and their families, and that you have to measure that man's ability to be an elder by how he managed his own house. You look at Don and Tracy's kids, the Arendt's kids, Norman, Tricia's kids. You look at, if I get somebody's name wrong, just bear with me. You look at all the other elders here and other people besides the elders, and you use them as examples. When you don't know how to do something, then go ask Miss Tracy, go ask Miss Debbie, go ask Miss Tricia. If you don't know how to do it, then go ask the men that are the elders of the congregation and others. And rear your children in a way that you'll be glad that you listen to others and to God. Charles Steinmetz was an electrical engineer in his day. I don't know much about him other than the story that I'm about to tell you. But he was very well known, and he was very well respected. He became what we would call a consultant now, and in his day he would go work for companies when they had problems. There was a huge company, manufacturing firm, that called him. They couldn't locate the problem. He was an electrical engineer. He came to the plant, brought all his instruments, worked and worked and worked. Finally, he went up to a piece of machinery. They said that he took out a piece of chalk and he just made an X on it, on the outside of it, and told him that's where your problem is. So they broke into it, tore it down, got to the problem, and sure enough, that's exactly where it was. And they repaired it all, and everything was restored. He sent them a bill. It might not sound like a lot today, but this is many, 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 many years ago. The bill was for $10,000, and they balked at paying it, so they wanted him to itemize it. So he sent them an itemized bill, 2 items, $1 for a chalk mark, $9,999 for knowing where to put the chalk mark. And they paid the bill. Know where to put the X. Know where to put the chalk mark. You'll be all right. You'll be all right. I will praise you with all